When Paul Walker arrives at an exclusive children's charity gala, wearing simple clothes instead of a tuxedo, the arrogant head of security immediately assumes he's trying to crash the event and publicly humiliates him in front of wealthy donors, refusing to believe he could possibly belong among Hollywood's elite. But what happens when the truth about who Paul really is and why he's there comes out will leave everyone in that ballroom absolutely stunned and prove that real class has nothing to do with what you wear. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another special story for you. The Beverly Hills Hotel gleamed under the warm California evening light, its iconic pink facade illuminated by elegant uplighting that cast a golden glow across the perfectly manicured grounds. Tonight, the hotel hosted one of the season's most exclusive charity events, the annual Children's Dream Foundation Gala, where Hollywood's elite gathered to raise money for children battling life-threatening illnesses. Luxury vehicles lined the curved driveway as valets in crisp white uniforms efficiently managed the arrival of guests. Ferrari after Porsche after Bentley rolled up to the red carpet entrance, each arrival more extravagant than the last. Women in designer gowns that cost more than most people's annual salaries stepped out gracefully, their jewelry catching the camera flashes, while men in perfectly tailored tuxedos adjusted their bow ties and smiled for the photographers stationed behind velvet ropes. This was the kind of event where appearances mattered as much as donations, where being seen was almost as important as the cause itself. The guest list read like a who's who of entertainment industry royalty, and everyone understood the unspoken rules. Dress to impress, arrive in style, and make sure your generosity was noticed. Marcus Thompson stood at his post near the main entrance, his broad shoulders filling out his black security uniform with obvious pride. At 38, Marcus had worked security for high-end events across Los Angeles for over a decade, and he took his job seriously, perhaps too seriously. His sharp eyes scanned every arrival, quickly categorizing guests into those who belonged and those who didn't. Marcus prided himself on his ability to spot trouble before it started. He could identify crashers, wannabes, and people who didn't fit the exclusive atmosphere from 50 yards away. To Marcus, maintaining the integrity of an event like this meant protecting the wealthy donors from any unwanted intrusions or disruptions. The evening's arrivals had been proceeding smoothly. Studio executives, A-list actors, socialites, and business moguls all arriving in appropriate splendor. Marcus checked his clipboard, mentally ticking off names as the familiar faces passed through the checkpoint. He was in his element, the gatekeeper of exclusivity. As the sun dipped lower behind the Beverly Hills skyline, a taxi pulled up to the entrance. Marcus immediately tensed. Taxis weren't typical transportation for this crowd, and his instincts told him to pay attention. The yellow car looked completely out of place among the luxury vehicles, and Marcus watched with growing suspicion as the passenger door opened. Paul Walker stepped out of the taxi, adjusting a simple navy blazer over dark jeans and a white button-down shirt. His hair was slightly tousled from the ride, and he wore clean but unremarkable black shoes that had clearly been chosen for comfort rather than fashion. He carried no designer accessories, wore no expensive watch, and moved with the unhurried pace of someone who wasn't trying to impress anyone. Paul looked around the elaborate entrance with a slight smile, taking in the red carpet, the photographers, and the obvious wealth on display. This wasn't his usual scene. He preferred smaller, more intimate gatherings where the focus was on the cause rather than the spectacle. But tonight was important to him for reasons that went far deeper than appearances. Marcus watched Paul approach the entrance, his expression shifting from alert to disapproving. Everything about this guy screamed wrong. The casual clothes, the taxi arrival, the complete absence of any Hollywood glamour. Marcus had seen enough party crashers to recognize the type, and this one wasn't even trying to hide it. As Paul reached the security checkpoint, Marcus stepped forward, his posture deliberately imposing. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Excuse me, sir," Marcus said, his tone professional but cold. "This is a private event. Do you have an invitation?" Paul looked up with his characteristic calm smile. Yes, I should be on the list. Paul Walker. Marcus glanced at his clipboard, running his finger down the guest list with exaggerated slowness. The name was there, clearly printed, but Marcus hesitated. The Paul Walker he was thinking of was a movie star, someone who would arrive in a limousine wearing a custom tuxedo, not some guy in jeans stepping out of a taxi. I see a Paul Walker on the list, Marcus said slowly, but I think there might be some confusion. This is a very exclusive event for entertainment industry professionals and major donors. Paul's smile remained patient. I understand. I'm here. For the children's charity. Marcus looked Paul up and down again, his skepticism obvious. Sir, the Paul Walker on this list is the actor from The Fast and the Furious. Are you claiming to be him? The question was asked with such condescension that several nearby guests turned to watch the interaction. Paul noticed the attention but remained calm. Yes, that's me. Marcus let out a short, disbelieving laugh. Right. Look, I don't know what game you're playing, but celebrities don't show up to events like this in jeans and a blazer. They definitely don't arrive in taxis. Paul's expression didn't change, though something flickered in his eyes. Not anger, but disappointment. He'd encountered this kind of judgment before, but it never stopped being frustrating. I prefer to keep things simple, Paul said quietly. The event is about the children, not about how I look. Marcus shook his head, his voice growing more authoritative. Sir, I'm going to need to ask you to leave. This is a $500 per plate dinner for Hollywood executives and major philanthropists. If you're looking for the Paul Walker look-alike contest, that's probably somewhere else. A small crowd had gathered now, drawn by Marcus's increasingly loud voice and the obvious confrontation. Well-dressed guests whispered among themselves, some pulling out phones to record what was unfolding. Paul stood quietly for a moment, processing the situation. He looked at Marcus, then at the gathering crowd, then back at Marcus. When he spoke, his voice was calm, but carried a weight that seemed to settle over the entire entrance area. I'm not trying to crash your event, Paul said. I'm not looking for free food or trying to meet celebrities. I'm here because I care about these children. Marcus crossed his arms, clearly unmoved. That's a nice story, but I've heard it all before. Everyone has a sob story when they're trying to get into events they can't afford. The words hung in the air like a slap. Paul felt the familiar sting of being judged solely on his appearance, of having his character questioned by someone who knew nothing about him. Sir, Marcus continued, his voice rising to ensure the gathering crowd could hear, I'm going to need you to step away from the entrance. You're disrupting the event for legitimate guests. Paul looked around at the legitimate guests. People, dripping in diamonds and designer clothes, many of whom he recognized as industry acquaintances. Some looked sympathetic, others seemed amused by the spectacle, but none stepped forward to intervene. What if I can prove who I am? Paul asked quietly. Marcus smirked. Oh, this should be good. Let me guess. You left your ID in your other jeans? Paul reached into his blazer pocket and pulled out his wallet, extracting his driver's license. He handed it to Marcus calmly without defensiveness or attitude. Marcus examined the license, his smirk faltering slightly as he saw the name Paul Walker clearly printed on the official document. But instead of apologizing, he doubled down. Anyone can get a fake ID, Marcus said, handing it back dismissively. I've seen better forgeries at college parties. The crowd murmured at this escalation. Some guests began to look uncomfortable with Marcus's behavior, but still no one intervened. Paul pocketed his license, his patience wearing thin, but his composure intact. What would it take to convince you? Marcus gestured around the elegant entrance. Mr. Walker, the real Paul Walker, would never show up to an event like this looking like he just came from a garage. He'd have stylists, security, probably a whole entourage. You look like you got lost on your way to a different party. The judgment in Marcus's voice was unmistakable, and it hit Paul harder than he expected. This wasn't just about getting into a party. It was about being dismissed and diminished in front of people who were supposedly here to help children. You know what? Paul said, his voice still calm but now carrying a different energy. "You're absolutely right about one thing." Marcus raised his eyebrows, thinking he'd won. "I am different from what you expected," Paul continued. "I do prefer jeans to tuxedos. I do take taxis instead of limousines. And I do think what you wear matters a lot less than why you're here." He looked around at the crowd that had gathered, his voice carrying easily through the evening air. But if you think those things disqualify someone from caring about sick children, then maybe we have very different ideas about what this event is supposed to be about." The crowd fell silent. Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, a voice cut through the tension. "Paul? Paul Walker?" Everyone turned to see a young woman in an elegant black dress approaching quickly. She wore a staff badge identifying her as Sarah Chen, event coordinator for the Children's Dream Foundation. "Mr. Walker," Sarah said, slightly out of breath, "I'm so sorry. I was watching for you inside. I had no idea you were being—" She looked at Marcus with obvious disapproval. Marcus's confident expression began to crack. You know this, guy?" Sarah looked at Marcus as if he'd just asked the most ridiculous question in the world. "This is Paul Walker. He's been one of our foundation's most generous supporters for 3 years. He's here tonight because he personally requested to meet some of the children we're helping." The color drained from Marcus's face. Around them, the crowd began to murmur more loudly, some expressing shock, others shaking their heads at the security guard's behavior. Paul smiled at Sarah warmly. "Hi, Sarah. Thank you for organizing tonight. I know how much work these events take." Sarah beamed. "Mr. Walker, the children have been so excited to meet you. When I told them you were coming, little Emma asked if you could teach her about cars, like in your movies." Paul's face lit up. "I'd love to meet Emma. That's why I'm here." Marcus stood frozen, the magnitude of his mistake beginning to sink in. This wasn't just any celebrity. This was one of the event's main sponsors. Someone who had donated hundreds of thousands of dollars to help sick children. "Mr. Walker," Marcus said, his voice cracking slightly, I didn't realize—" Paul turned to him, his expression free of anger or resentment. "You didn't realize what, Marcus? That someone in jeans could care about children? That someone who takes taxis might have something valuable to contribute?" Marcus couldn't meet his eyes. "I was just doing my job." Paul nodded slowly. "I understand that. But your job is to protect an event dedicated to helping children. When you judge people based on their clothes or their car, you might be keeping out exactly the kind of person these kids need." The crowd watched in stunned silence as Paul continued, his voice gentle but firm. "These children don't care if someone arrives in a limousine or a taxi. They don't care about designer suits or expensive jewelry. They care about kindness, about people who see them as more than their illness." Paul looked around at the assembled guests, many of whom were clearly moved by his words. "And maybe that's what we should care about, too." Sarah stepped forward. "Mr. Walker, would you like to come inside? The children are in the quiet room, away from the main event. They're so excited to meet you." Paul smiled. "That's exactly where I want to be." As Paul and Sarah headed toward the entrance, Paul paused and turned back to Marcus. The security guard stood alone now, the crowd having dispersed, looking smaller and more vulnerable than he had minutes before. "Marcus," Paul said quietly, approaching him, "can I tell you something?" Marcus nodded, unable to speak. "I used to judge people too," Paul said. "I used to think I could tell everything about someone by looking at them. But working with these kids, spending time with families going through the hardest experiences of their lives, it taught me that the most important things about a person are usually invisible." Marcus finally found his voice. "Mr. Walker, I'm so sorry. I was completely wrong." Paul placed a gentle hand on Marcus's shoulder. "We all make mistakes. The question is what we do after we realize we've made them." Marcus looked up, tears beginning to form in his eyes. "How do I make this right?" Paul smiled. "Come inside, meet the children. See what this is really about." Marcus blinked in surprise. You want me to come in?" After what I did? Paul nodded. Everyone deserves a chance to understand what really matters. An hour later, Marcus stood in the quiet room watching Paul Walker sit on the floor with a group of children, showing them pictures of cars on his phone and listening intently as they told him about their dreams. Little Emma, a 7-year-old with leukemia, sat in Paul's lap as he explained how engines worked, her face glowing with joy. Marcus had expected to see a celebrity going through the motions, posing for photos and making a quick appearance. Instead, he saw a man who genuinely loved being with these kids, who remembered their names from previous visits, who asked about their treatments and their families with real concern. "He's been here for 2 hours," Sarah whispered to Marcus. "He was supposed to make a brief appearance, but he asked if he could stay longer. He does this at every event." Marcus watched as Paul helped a young boy in a wheelchair adjust the toy car he'd brought as a gift, both of them laughing as they figured out how to make it go faster. This wasn't about publicity or tax deductions. This was about connection, about using fame to bring joy to children who needed it most. "Sarah," Marcus said quietly, "I need to apologize to everyone. What I did tonight was wrong." Sarah nodded. "But you're here now. That's what matters." As the evening wound down, Paul prepared to leave. He said goodbye to each child individually, promising to visit again soon and making sure they all had his personal contact information in case they ever wanted to talk about cars or anything else. Marcus approached him near the exit, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine humility. "Mr. Walker, I want you to know that tonight changed how I see things, how I see people." Paul smiled. "That's all anyone can ask for, Marcus. Growth, understanding, the willingness to be better tomorrow than we were today." Marcus nodded. "I've been doing security work for 10 years, but I never understood what I was really protecting until tonight. It's not about keeping people out. It's about keeping what matters safe." Paul shook Marcus's hand. "Now you get it." As Paul walked toward the taxi that Sarah had called for him, Marcus called after him. "Mr. Walker, next time you come to one of these events, you won't have any trouble at the door, I promise." Paul turned back with a grin. "I'm holding you to that. But Marcus?" "Yes, sir? Don't just make it easier for me. Make it easier for everyone who comes here with a good heart, regardless of what they're wearing." 3 months later, Marcus was working another charity event when a woman in worn jeans and a simple sweater approached the entrance. His old instincts kicked in for a moment. She didn't look like she belonged among the evening's elegantly dressed guests. But then Marcus remembered Paul Walker's words, remembered little Emma's laughter, remembered the lesson he'd learned about looking beyond appearances. Instead of challenging the woman, he smiled warmly. "Good evening. How can I help you?" The woman looked surprised by his welcoming tone. "I'm Dr. Lisa Martinez. I work at Children's Hospital, and I was invited to speak about our new research program." Marcus checked his list and found her name. "Dr. Martinez, we've been expecting you. The children are so excited to hear about your work." As he escorted her inside, Marcus thought about how different this interaction might have been just a few months ago. He had learned that the most important people at events like this weren't always the ones who looked the part. Sometimes they were the doctors, the researchers, the social workers, and the volunteers who did the real work of helping children. Paul Walker had taught him that respect wasn't about what someone wore or how they arrived. It was about recognizing the value in every person who chose to use their time, their talents, or their resources to make the world a little better. And every time Marcus saw a child smile because of someone's generosity, he remembered that night at the Beverly Hills Hotel when he almost kept out the one person who mattered most. Because sometimes the most important lessons come not from textbooks or training seminars, but from the moment when someone chooses grace over anger, understanding over judgment, and inclusion over exclusion. Paul Walker had shown Marcus that real class wasn't about designer clothes or expensive cars. Real class was about treating every person with dignity, seeing potential instead of problems, and understanding that the best way to protect something precious was to make sure everyone who cared about it felt welcome. Years later, when Marcus would tell people about the night he met Paul Walker, He wouldn't focus on his own mistakes or embarrassment. Instead, he would talk about a man who could have destroyed his career with a single phone call, but chose instead to teach him something more valuable than any job: the importance of seeing people's hearts rather than their appearances. Because, in the end, that's what separated Paul Walker from so many other celebrities. It wasn't his movies, or his fame, or his success. It was his unwavering belief that everyone deserved to be seen, respected, and given a chance to show the best of themselves. And on that night at the Beverly Hills Hotel, Marcus learned that sometimes the most casually dressed person in the room is the one with the most class of all. The lesson would stay with him forever. Never judge someone's worth by their wrapper, because the most precious gifts often come in the simplest packages, and every child who benefited from the events Marcus protected after that night, he owed a small debt to Paul Walker, not for his donations or his fame, but for his patience in teaching one security guard that the door to kindness should always be open, regardless of who's standing on the other side.